Thank you so much for joining us this morning for this year's area potato production meeting. I think we have some really great information to share with you today. So the first half of our meeting, we are going to have Dr. Amanda Gevins, University of Wisconsin-Madison professor, and extension plant pathologist she is going to be presenting about disease management in potatoes. And then following her presentation, we are going to have a panel discussion with Dr. Jean Restano, NC State professor in entomology and plant pathology department, as well as Anders Huseth, an NC State assistant professor and extension specialist. Dr. Gevins, with you.
Hey, thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation. Okay, can folks see my screen in full presentation mode? Okay, thanks. Always appreciate those thumbs up. So I appreciate the invite and in giving some thought to how to frame this discussion in light of what seemed to be interest in a number of diseases that I work on and certainly could offer some information on. I decided to package this around resistance management, fungicide resistance management, and give an emphasis on early blight management, as well as a little bit on late blight and the way we sort of think about and prepare for management of late blight here in Wisconsin. But then also offer a bit of information about seed treatments and in furrows, again, from the perspective of resistance management. I think now more than ever, we have a rich menu of fungicide options in potatoes, and I call that a good problem here in our state when we think about how to build programs. We have more tools than we have in a long time. Some work better than others. Some are quite specific. Some have different kinds of activities in terms of residual and time frame. But we have to think about how best to steward these tools as we move forward in disease management in potato. So I just want to acknowledge, I've got a number of co-authors on the presentation. Many of these are students. These are academic staff members, and I want to thank them for elements that will come up in the talk. This is work that I certainly don't do in isolation. So to get started, I wanted to share with you, again, these are Wisconsin-specific information resources, but part of the process of integrated resistance management and disease management is access to and utilization of such support tools. And so I wanted to at least get us started here in sharing with you some of the tools which our producers use here in state to manage disease, or at least the direction I send them in when there are questions about management. And so first off, we have a newsletter that goes out on a weekly basis through our production season. These start often in mid-April, and that's typically the earliest of the planting dates for Wisconsin potatoes. And then they run through typically to October, to what would be probably the latest harvest date in some years. And they offer weekly updates on various features of potato and vegetable agronomy. We have contributors from entomology, from horticulture, from soil science, and other departments as relevant to the status of the production season. And so this newsletter comes out, and again, anyone can get this. So I send this out to our grower association, but if folks are interested in the content out of state, we certainly have readers in the upper Midwest generally, but also outside of our region as well, if folks are interested. And within the newsletter, I provide reference to a number of our disease modeling or forecasting tools that help to dictate the timing of initiation of certain fungicide applications for particularly early blight and late blight control. And it provides updates on the status of these diseases. So for some diseases that we don't expect to have resident populations, but we expect to have an introduced new population in a given year, and specifically I'm speaking of late blight there. This newsletter is very important because, and Jean could certainly talk more about the USA blight and late blight detection and reporting from that angle. But I do provide those updates in the newsletter as well as other more local updates so that we're aware of where the pathogen is. We're aware of where there have been reports to date, and growers can help. It helps growers to anticipate the need for management, along with use of tools that are triggered by environmental condition. So there's this newsletter, and so that's a source of information. We also have a website which offers sort of on demand, if you will, information about disease and insect pest modeling. It gives information about the risk based on a 12-kilometer grid. And so regardless of where you are in the state, whether you're near a research or university weather station or not, you can access information to help support decision-making on the farm. So that's available at the website. And then lastly, we have a portal that contains all of our research reports from the Wisconsin Potato and Vegetable Growers Association and UW Extension's educational conference. So we have a large potato conference every February. And one of the sort of residual products from this meeting, outside of the immediate talks and networking opportunities, is a database of reports that come from our research community and outside of, if we have invited guest presenters from other states. But this is then a portal for field reports, updates on any innovative research within the agronomy of potatoes. So just want to lead you to some helpful tools if needed, and if there are any questions about these elements, please feel free to contact me. So in potatoes, fungicides are important, and I think this audience, there's no need to justify this too much further, but we have susceptibility of cultivars. While there is variation in the way a given cultivar will respond to a given disease, it's very rare that we would have any kind of complete resistance to a whole suite of diseases. And so we have to be mindful of that. We have favorable weather. Here in Wisconsin, we have almost a persistent relative humidity that's pushes disease. And we have volatile precipitation. We also have an irrigated crop. So we've got moisture. We've got the element that can push disease. In North Carolina, very similar status in that regard. And then presence of pathogens. So where we have pathogens that are hanging out in crop debris and residue that have persistence in the agricultural ecosystem over time, it's a source. And so I've got center in this slide what we call the disease triangle. And when these components come together, they in a favorable way, and by that I mean the environment. We always have weather, but it's the kind of weather that makes disease that is most concerning to plant pathology, and we have that kind of weather for the bulk of our production season here in our state, and similarly in North Carolina. So when these favorable elements come together, we make disease, and this happens with regularity, and so there's need for some kind of activity to manage. Without doing anything, disease can certainly reduce crop yield, crop quality in the production field, but also when we consider a crop that may be moving into storage to feed raw product lines or for fresh market. It's a big concern, right? We want a clean, healthy crop going into storage so that we have not introduced pathogens into that environment to make that a more challenging place to manage disease. All right, so in thinking about disease here in our state of Wisconsin or in North Carolina, I'm trying not to be too specific here. Move this over. We think of this as a calendar or a timeline. At least this is the way I think about and package disease management programs with and for and to our growers. But in early season, we have diseases that are often favored by cooler, wet conditions in the soil. This is also a time when we start to see some of the problems from storage or problems in seed quality that emerge as things like poor or lack of emergence, These would be Rhizoctonia diseases. Sometimes Fusarium can creep in here. But there are problems here with quality of seed or favorability for disease in that seed during a time when we really expect and require rapid growth, warmer temperatures, relatively drier soil environment to get that seed piece going and out of the ground. So early season, we have concerns. As we move on through the production season, we see a number of other disease concerns. Early blight, black leg, white mold, botrytis, brown spot. These are, again, really common in northern climes, but certainly not foreign to you folks as we move down the eastern seaboard as well. We see late blight, early dying then appear later in season. We see formation of black dot in lower canopies, pink rot in tubers in time. And then this takes us into the post-harvest phase where we see diseases like silver scurf, Pythium leek can arise, late blight, various scabs, and Fusarium. So there's a lot to work on. There's a lot to be concerned with, and I don't share this to frighten. I share this for appropriate preparation, right? That we have a season-long effort in front of us when we think about disease management. So we think about the use of fungicides to cover multiple diseases, multiple targets, and we have to also be mindful of where these pathogens are when we think about then imposing fungicides on them to try to manage. But what we're also doing is providing a selection pressure in those pathogen populations that push toward resistance to the certain fungicide active ingredients that we're counting on to work for us. All right, so what I'm going to do here this morning is, again, I have a list of some of these diseases that, in the way I think about them, and thinking about an overall plan for disease management, we pretty steadily have concerns in Wisconsin with early blight and lately annually with late blight, but it is more sporadic. Incidence is less, but if it's not managed well, it just can eat your lunch. So we've got to keep up with our management plan there. And then the diseases in this lower menu, if you will, these are diseases that need to be managed in ways other than a sort of standardized foliar fungicide program, and in a more targeted approach, depending upon where they're occurring, because some of these have site specificity, right? So they're not diseases that we may be treating all acres for, but they're diseases in which we may be treating unique fields or positions within a unique field for. Things like white mold and pink rot. Pythium leek is a sort of a later season quality issue, but one that we think about particularly for managing in season for stored potatoes. And then black scurf and Rhizoctonia, silver scurf, black dot, and Fusarium dry rot. So the diseases here that are emboldened are the ones I'll particularly focus on in the presentation forward. So just to visualize what we think about fungicide resistance development, I just wanted to share what is going on. And I'm using here it's a simple cartoon, but I found it online from Emeritus Professor Alan York from NCSU, and I thought I'd use it. But what's going on here? So when we're considering a pathogen population, and so these would be all members of, let's use Alternaria solani, which causes early blight in potato. So we have a population that's in crop debris and residue in and around fields and in weed species as well that would host Alternaria solani. But the pathogen that's within that those environmental positions, that's our population. And say a given active ingredient, we'll discuss here azoxystrobin, right? A QOI fungicide, and specifically we'll talk about azoxystrobin here. So now we'll be thinking back maybe 40 years, maybe 30 years, but at its initiation of usage, and this is probably more like 25 years prior to research of, but the population generally had sensitivity to azoxystrobin. But there's probably a small percentage of that population that had some resistance, some natural resistance, or proclivity to not responding well to that particular active ingredient, to azoxystrobin. Right. The other thing that happens is azoxystrobin and other active ingredients can also create a mutation. Right. So there are different ways in which resistance can initiate. But in this depiction here, there's a member of this population that's got resistance to the active ingredient. And then as that active ingredient, as azoxystrobin is continued in usage, we continue to select for the resistant ones, right? Because those are the ones that are not killed by the treatment with the particular fungicide, and so they thrive, they reproduce and make more of themselves, right? And then again, subsequent year, again, this is maybe a description about a region, but with each year and each additional usage of azoxystrobin as that selecting agent, you're enhancing the percentage of the population that has resistance to that particular fungicide. Right, so we see more and more of it until ultimately most of that population is resistant to azoxystrobin in this scenario, and therefore it no longer works. Right, at least it no longer works for this particular disease of concern. It may work for others, but again, just depends upon the unique situation of that disease and pathogen. Right? The pathogen may not be hiding out in the residue, may not be receiving as many repeated applications of that specific fungicide, and therefore we don't have as much resistance built up. Some cases, pathogens don't, they may not have as many mutations, so we're not pushing resistance as fast. So this is just one scenario, but I wanted to provide the visualization because I think it's helpful as we think about what is happening in the pathogen population over time that makes the single site mode of action, which tend to be the reduced risk pesticides, makes them more vulnerable to the development of resistance, and why we have to be so careful in following fungicide labels and so careful in stewardship of these chemistries, especially as they get added to premixes in ways that we may not be aware, or they're added to premixes as a seed treatment or an in-furrow treatment or as a post-harvest storage treatment for seed. So we have to be mindful of all the places in which these fungicides are present in our disease management strategy so that we can help prevent this accumulation of resistance in the pathogen population in time. Right. So to get started, I'll start with the seed. It's where the crop begins, and I think it's logical to start there. But thinking about the target diseases for seed-applied fungicide. So what I had done in assembling this is just sort of look through all of our registrations, right? What do we have in a more comprehensive way to put on seed to limit against common diseases? And so those fungicides that are registered as seed treatments for management of Rhizoctonia, Fusarium, and silver scurf. And often with silver scurf, the labels do include, black dot or Colototricum, but again, they're also hard to diagnose uniquely at times. So silver scurf certainly may encompass black dot. But here we have difenoconazole, right? This is salient. There are others as well now. I'm just using one commercial fungicide for this example. There's Maxim, which is fludioxonil, which is a fairly common seed treatment, at least up in the north central states. We see a number of treatments coming from Syngenta now that have Sidaxane. And one of them is Vibrance. There are some premixes that include Sidaxane now. We know about Mancozeb. This is a longer standing fungicide for seed treatment that helps against these true fungal diseases, but also against a disease like late blight in limiting seed piece to seed piece movement of the disease. And then we have Moncote, which is flutolenil, another longer standing seed applied treatment. And we have more recently, but in the last decade, Imesto Silver, which is penflufen and prothioconazole. All right, so we have, I'd say, a shorter menu of active ingredients to use on seed. But as we look at these names and we look at some of the fungicide names that come up in foliar treatments, it's a lot of the same fungicides and same groups. So what I have listed here, what says FRAC 3, and then the rest of these just follow with numbers like 12 and 7, M3, 7. These are numbers referring to the code that is part of the Fungicide Resistance Action Committee. And this is a global system for helping to keep track of and organize fungicide resistance management. There's an organization like this that manages insecticides as well, known as IRAC, but this is FRAC. And so where you see numbers throughout my presentation, it's referring to these categories of fungicide active ingredients that in a sort of general rule of thumb, you don't want to have too many of the same numbers, right? Because you want to alternate and rotate chemistries so that you don't build fungicide resistance. Where you see an M in there, so for example, dithane or mancozeb is M3, this refers to multi-site, right? And so what that means is it's not, that particular fungicide is not pushing resistance in the pathogen population because it is not a single site mode of action fungicide. So M's are good when we think about fungicide resistance. They also tend to be fungicides with very broad spectrum activity that are not so exclusive to an individual pathogen or group of pathogens. But we have very few of them any longer, right? So through EPA and re-registration efforts, these broad spectrums tend to be that have a greater toxicological footprint, right? They can have a bit more off-target impact, and so we have fewer of them, right? So we have mancozeb, and in potatoes we also have chlorothalonil. We still also have a fungicide like Xyram, which is in this category, and the tins, right, triphenyl tin. So that's about it. Right? When we think about these multi-sites in potato, we in Wisconsin think about mancozeb and chlorothalonil usually as our two, and we think about ways of using those strategically so we get the activity of a broad spectrum. We also use them in helping to balance our fungicide resistance plans. Right. So then I mentioned there are several premixes that come from Syngenta, and I think it's helpful to make a table. And if folks are interested in this, I'm glad to share what I have. I'm not going to focus the talk on this, but it gets a little confusing every time there's an additional fungicide added in. We think about how is it contributing to the overall management, and we have to think about it in its placement in our overall program, because there may be up to 4 fungicides in these newer premixes now that we have to be mindful of. Okay, and then the seed-applied fungicides that target late blight. Here I have this broken out separately because this does require unique chemistry. We see mancozeb here, as I mentioned, mandipropamid, which is Revis, and cymoxanil, which is Curzate. All right. So in furrow, there are fewer potential treatments in this placement. Quadris has been a longer-standing in-furrow treatment that's had good function, particularly for Rhizoctonia control here in the upper Midwest. Historically, it's provided decent control of silver scurf and black dot as well. We're seeing less of that with some resistance development. But now this Quadris is in another premix, which is Elatus. This has azoxystrobin with benzovindiflupyr or solatinol, and this has been a really nice addition. I don't know if folks in North Carolina are using this, but Elatus now in furrow has really been a game changer for many in both management of Rhizoctonia, as well as silver scurf, black dot, and getting some fusarium control out of that treatment as well. But that in furrow, again, really nice addition. Particularly, we've been seeing an uptick of silver scurf in potatoes over the last decade, and it's really helped to see a reduction in silver scurf due to this Elatus. And then we can use biologicals. We have various bacilluses registered for this placement. In this state, we've looked at double nickel and serenade. There are numerous others within bacillus, subtilis and pumilis and amyloliquefactions in this category. And again, some varied response of these treatments in furrow, but sometimes and in some placements it has significantly enhanced disease control. For late blight, the azoxystrobin in furrow can help. Strobilurins are they're good fungicides against water molds, but like late blight, but not the best, right? So they're good in prevention or suppression, but not the best when there is a a more serious threat or concern with seed quality and with respect to late blight. And then double nickel, serenade, these other biologicals are also registered for late blight control, but I haven't seen that kind of activity to recommend them in this placement. So I want to start with just this early season. So when you think about seed-applied fungicides on seed, seed-applied fungicides on seed, well, one thing that concerned us here in our state was the reduced emergence seen in some cases. Right, so we've been exploring this more in a more focused manner over the last 5 years in my research program. One thing we're seeing is just an overwhelming response of supervisation, right? So this is going back to just good, sound seed handling. But the difference that we see, particularly, this is 30 days post-planting, and this is in russet Burbank. We have some comparative data in dark red Norland, and the goal here is to show a russet type that these tend to have less moisture, right? So we have drier tubers compared to wetter tubers, and we propose that maybe there'd be some differences here, and we did see some. But as you can see in this figure, and I'm not going to belabor it too much, but when we suberize seed, meaning we cut it, we maintain it at about 55 degrees Fahrenheit with high quality airflow through that storage for 3 to 7 days, we see enhanced emergence, right? So the seeds that are suberized are, the data here is shown in orange. And so these are our most rapid emergers, if you will, across treatments, regardless of seed-applied treatment. So where we're suberizing, we see a more rapid emergence. Where we're not suberizing, we see a significant reduction in emergence from, here, what was about 85, 90% emergence to, down to about 50, right? So it's nearly cutting our emergence at 30 days in half when we don't suberize. But then we found when we add, in this case, we just use Maxim as our representative fungicide treatment on seed. When we added Maxim to that mix, it further reduced emergence on non-suberized seed. So it's something to think about. We've done this a couple years in a row, and we see this same kind of result. This does catch up. So it looks a little scary to look at this difference at 30 days. When we move outward to 40, even 45 days, which this figure is basically taking a look at some of the same data, but taking it out from 30 days, which is represented by this red line. That's 30 days post-planting. The end of this figure here on the far right would be about day 45. But things are catching up. But you'll note all of the lines, they're colorized differently based on treatment, but the dotted lines represent non-suberized seed. So as you can see here, again, not suberizing seed, not everything's catching up. We do see non-treated seed, so no Maxim, not suberized, is catching up. And the Maxim treatment with suberization, the Maxim with new bark, and the suberization with new bark all are on par. These are all emerging at about 100%, but the non-suberized treatments with new bark, Maxim and new bark, and Maxim alone are still trailing by about 10 to 20%. So again, important to note here, we've seen this again for 2 to 3 years now in our field trials, 2021 being the last year. With dark red Norland, it's a little less pronounced, but generally we do see the non-suberized seed just tailing a little bit compared to the suberized seed in terms of emergence. And this is important, right? I mean, this is your initiation of your crop, and this is tightly linked to yield, right? So I mean, the number of plants and the capacity to generate tubers is affected here. The capacity to balance your profile in tuber size is sort of borne out here too, right? So if you have fewer plants, the tubers that are developing in that row will compensate, right? So you get a bigger profile of tubers, and sometimes that's okay, but sometimes that's very much not okay, right? And so it's something to consider. Okay, so we'll move into early blight, and boy, I'm getting close to time here. Just to to move us along, so I just want to mention the disease cycle, right? So the pathogen is on site. It's a residual pathogen in debris, in weed species that are in around the field. And so that's where our inoculum is coming from. And I think that's important to be aware of and make note of. Here in Wisconsin, we see progression that starts usually late June, first week of July, and then enhances. And once we get through the month of August, in the average production season, we start to see defoliation of that crop due to early blight. Sometimes brown spot. So brown spot is Alternaria alternata. It's a second Alternaria species that can also create foliar disease. But we know that these two pathogens have unique resistance responses to fungicide. So it's important to know what you have there, even though if you look at this photo from August 30th, there's sort of just this gamish of spots, right? And you probably have some Alternaria solani, some early blight, and some brown spot, some Alternaria alternata in the mix. But it's important to know what is there, and if you suddenly have more pronounced brown spot, that's important to know as well, to best prescribe a fungicide program that'll rein that in. Right. So for early blight management and brown spot management, we have a number of fungicides. What I've listed here are these categories. The QOI or group 11s that includes azoxystrobin that I used as the example earlier. Here now in Wisconsin, we don't get activity at all out of using azoxystrobin against early blight or brown spot, and so we're moving to other chemistries. The DMI group, which is next here in line, the demethylation inhibitors, this group 3. These have had just a really lovely place in foliar disease management in over the last, let's say 6 or 7 years since we've added in difenoconazole, which is a part of Revis top. It's the top part. From Syngenta, we've also had metconazole, which is Quash out of Valent. That's been a nice addition. Most recently, we've had some newer group 3s with Provazole out of BASF. Really nice additional DMIs to add in. But as the potato crop is starting to see more of these group 3s, more triazoles, no doubt resistance will come into play. So we have to be careful in where and how we use these group 3s in managing disease. Down the bottom of the slide here is group 9. These are the anilino-pyrimidines. Treatments like cyprodenil and pyrimethanil. Some of these are components of premixed fungicides. There's some resistance known to the group 9s, but again, these are group 9s are now commonly showing up in premixes. Good control of foliar Alternaria species in most cases. The group which has gotten a lot of activity in the last decade is this group 7. Right? So we've had boscalid, which is Endura, for a bit longer now, probably closer to 15 years. And it's still working pretty well in Wisconsin for early blight and brown spot management, but we are noting some increased resistance. And so in some parts of the state, this is less effective, and it's important to track how long you've been using it. And sometimes I encourage growers to try a newer active ingredient, like try Provazole or try Revis top, or just the top piece alone, the difenoconazole piece, and see what kind of activity you get. And if you could do that like on half a pivot, right, half a field, and have a toe-to-toe comparison, it'll help you understand if you've got some resistance issues to something like Endura. As you may not know, you get used to using these treatments and these programs, and it seems like as long as they work pretty well, you may keep with it. But sometimes you don't notice when that slipping starts. But again, it certainly has still a place here in Wisconsin, but we're watchful of this. All right, so in trying to manage resistance in field, it's important to identify your primary diseases, as I mentioned. Do you have early blight? Do you have brown spot? When's it appearing? And how is it persisting through the production season? If you can get some support through extension, and there are labs that will help you with the determination of resistance, if there's a lab that can help identify mutation in these populations, that can be helpful. If not, you can run a comparative field trial, as I mentioned, and introduce a newer fungicide and just look to see what's happening. But this can be really useful. The challenge in pathogen screening is that I often describe it as a postcard of data, right? So as a grower, you may make a collection at a certain time of that field season. You got spots on foliage, you put it in a Ziploc, you send it to a lab, and the data that comes of that is as good as that one bag, right, from that one time of sampling and collection. And so it gives you a little bit of information, but it often takes, I like to see at least 2 samples, maybe over time, to get a better understanding of what's going on in the population that's affecting your field. Even better is sort of a field level comparison to see what's happening than season long with a revised fungicide program. And so managing resistance, using varietal resistance when you can. I know with early blight, there's certainly on a sliding scale, but sometimes your variety is selected for, you're not just making choices for disease management, you're making choices for the marketplace, and you can't always pick the most resistant. But understand also where your pressure is highest. That's often where you've had the most concentrated potato production with the tightest rotational structures in recent years is where you'll see the most disease and pressure. So you'll want to be thoughtful of initiating your fungicide program sooner, right? So you don't want disease to get out of hand before you start using these tools. That will that burns them out a lot more rapidly. Manage moisture in the crop to reduce that the push for disease in that field that makes it optimum for disease. Rotational strategies can help limit the pathogen because you're limiting the amount of viable pathogen within that crop residue. Starting with clean seed to limit pathogen. Thoroughly apply fungicide in advance of infection, and we often use physiological or P days or potato P days in Wisconsin to initiate the first of fungicide applications for the control of early blight and brown spot. And that most typically is, it's a calculation for the advancement of potato maturation or physiological maturation. And it's been aligned with the time at which the early blight pathogen begins to be active in the field. So we use that. And that typically aligns around with plantings of late April into early May. That aligns with usually the 4th of July. It also aligns with row touch, right? And so growers often think of this not from the disease modeling tools, but they think of this logistically, that you'll want to get your first spray out before or just at that time when rows are closing, because that's at that point forward, you're never getting as good of a lower canopy treatment as you can, right? So you want to make that first application when you have best access to the lower canopy, and that's often just before or at row touch. Right. Think about building fungicide programs that have a multi-site mode of action in combination with these single-site modes of action, and then alternating. So what I'm going to take you to here is here. So here's a sample program that we consider in Wisconsin, when I'm talking to growers about how to build programming, or I'm thinking about how to study a new fungicide to place into our programs. We think of it like this, and this is at base it's a 10 spray program. So let me rein in the information you're looking at. We'll look at treatment 2 here. So this is full program number 2, and what you're seeing is at spray or application timing, this is 1, 2, 4, and 8. So that's spray number 1 would occur at that time point at row touch. Spray 2 would be 1 week later. Spray 3 would be, in this case, it's Preaxor plus a Bravo plus a chlorothalonil. Then we go back, we rotate back or alternate back to chlorothalonil alone for spray 4. Then we go to a spray 5, which in this case it's Endura plus a chlorothalonil. Then for 6, we're going back to Preaxor plus Bravo. For 7, we're going back to Enduro plus Bravo. And then for 8, we're going back to Bravo alone. And then 9 and 10, we make the switch here in Wisconsin to away from chlorothalonils, which are used as, I call them the anchor multi-site or broad spectrum fungicide. We move to mancozeb. And the reason for that is mancozeb it has a higher toxicological footprint environmentally, but it is much better at late season, late blight control, at limiting tuber blight. So what the activity is here is that the mancozeb applied, if it's hitting the plant, that's helpful, but if also it's making its way and you're making contact with the soil, it helps to reduce the viability of any late blight spores that may be entering that field in a spore shower or aerial movement late season. And mancozeb works significantly better than chlorothalonil in this activity, in this placement. And so I always make the switch in making recommendations to growers to this mancozeb very late season for the last 2 sprays. And in fact, often they'll, again, in years in which we've had late blight in the state of Wisconsin, they'll also add in a triphenyl tin here, a super tin, in a last spray or 2. Super tin certainly is industry-wide. There's interest in moving away from its usage, but when we've had late blight, our growers go pretty heavy. They're very heavy-handed in managing late blight late season because we have a substantial storage crop. And we just want to be sure that crop is going into the storage in the cleanest shape possible. So this isn't common in all spray programs in all years, but I'm just using it as an example here. So the 2 components of the spray program that I have highlighted in red here, these are sprays 3 through 7. This is the area that has a lot of play, right? So when I'm exploring new fungicides, this is where I target switching out, right? So I'd switch out a Preaxor with a Provosol, or switch out a Preaxor with a Luna Tranquility. And we did that for a number of years. And these are all, or I should say Miravis Prime, another newer Syngenta foliar fungicide. And we see enhanced activity when we do this, right? So I just wanted to make mention that in thinking about where to use these newer chemistries, and now we have so many choices, I think about this spray 3 to 7 interval, and that's where we've demonstrated year after year that those treatment times have the greatest impact in maintaining health of the crop and maintaining yield and quality post-harvest. In this separate program below it here, spray or program 3, I should say, the only difference here is that we have the maxim. We have a fludioxonil and a mancozeb on the seed piece at time of planting, and in some years we see that as working well, and we see an improved outcome compared to our non-seed treated programs. In this particular year, this was a 2020 data. We actually saw a reduction in foliar disease control, which again doesn't make too much sense given what's happening here, but sometimes that happens in field trials. But nonetheless, these are example programs of how we build fungicide programs for our growers. Sometimes the spray program is lengthier than needed, right? So sometimes if it's a shorter season potato, or we have hot, dry weather, and we can extend out the intervals beyond 7 days, it may mean it's an 8 spray program for that year. In other years where we've had wetter, cooler weather, and we've had presence of late blight in a number of counties, we might see that the spray program extends out beyond 10 to something more like 15. And then we have to be careful for season limits of use of materials like chlorothalonil and mancozeb. At this point, I know I've spoken beyond the 30 minutes. What's your pleasure? Should I take a break here, or I just have a little bit more on late blight that I can share, but I'm also happy to pause and take questions.
If there's any burning questions anybody has right now, we'll give your voice a break for a second. But if not, if maybe a 3-minute warning, if we could wrap it up by then, and then we'll move into the question and answer section, if that's okay, Dr. Gevins.
Sounds fine. I can't see the chat, so if something's coming up, please let me know. If not, I'll
Yeah, I don't see anything coming up.
continue
So
on.
yeah, you can
Okay,
roll right on and we can wrap it up and then go to the
okay.
questions afterwards.
Will do. Will do. And I'll prepare this nicely for Jean. So in tracking of late blight, we use this really lovely, well-established tool that Jean's been involved with developing over the years, and that's the USA Blight application. And this is dependent upon folks reporting positive cases of late blight around the country at county level. And so this is a season summary from 2021, and there was just a handful of reports in the confirmed reports around the United States and some here in Ontario, Canada as well. But this is extremely helpful to our producers, especially those operations that have multiple states engaged, and they're trying to track the location of late blight to best manage. There's also oodles of other resources at the website, which is helpful for management. Here in Wisconsin this past year, we had just 4 cases of confirmed late blight. Started late July in commercial potato, where fields are heavily and routinely scouted. And then the last came at the end of September in home garden tomato, all in the same county. This was all one Portage County in central Wisconsin. Was managed very well, and that's why we didn't see a more widespread movement outside of just a few fields in this year. But all of this was typed as US 23. And the typing is important to us here in our state and other states, but this is something that my program, we've maintained the service to our growers to keep tracking the types of the late blight pathogen that do arise in the state. What this is depicting is just the change we've seen here in Wisconsin over the last 12 years. So my career here with Wisconsin started in 2009, and I started tracking in that year. We had a bit more diversity of the kinds of late blight that were around in the state at that time. Since about 2012 onward, we've almost seen exclusively the US 23 type, which generally has sensitivity to ridamil, which is mefenoxam. But that is changing, and we've been looking into that a little bit within my program, and I know others have as well. But the strain type's important to us, especially where we might see opposing mating types in proximity. We don't want to see mating populations establish and greater diversity or endemic late blight here in our state or anywhere else. So we keep looking at this. And US 23, it's not new any longer, but it was new in 2010. Can certainly move to both tomato and potato, and we're watchful of it in both of those domains here in our state. The other thing we use is BlightCast, and this is a long-standing tool. We accumulate what are known as disease severity values from time of crop emergence and help growers track this status by location here in the state. And when we hit this threshold of a disease severity value 18, which typically happens usually about a week after our early blight spray programs start, so it's about a week after row touch. They begin also adding late blight specific fungicides into their spray programs, right? And some of these can be in the form of the base protectants that I mentioned earlier. They're decent broad spectrum protectants, but when disease risk is closer at hand or disease is on site, they'll move to something more specific. And so just a listing, here's a comprehensive listing of what's registered for late blight management in potato. This table is just all of the multi-site broad spectrums, which I mentioned already, chlorothalonil, mancozeb. Copper is certainly fits in this category, and some are registered for organic usage. Metarem and Supertin as well are here, but we no longer use Metarem in potatoes in our state. But then the specialties. So these are the single site modes of actions that have a greater residual activity. Some of these have systemic activity. Some have a bit of curative activity for late blight control. And I just have highlighted ridamil here as one that I'd mentioned with respect to the US 23 strain type and its response to this particular fungicide. But we do have a number of options for use in late blight management. We tend to look at the activity column here and look at as well as PHI if we're considering tomatoes in some cases. But for potato mainly, we're looking at this activity to best prevent, right? So in a crop that when we get to a point where we're not irrigating as heavily, it's less of a concern. But when we're continuing to irrigate the crop and we're putting out fungicides, and we often have heavy dews and some sporadic rain, we're very mindful of what kind of protection that we have internalized in that plant to keep the potatoes most protected against late blight in Wisconsin. So just wanted to share that with you, and then here I'll wrap up and be glad to have further discussion and questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Gevins. Really appreciate having you join us this morning. You know, I'll be the first one to say that I prefer everybody getting together and face-to-face meetings. But, you know, one of the nice things about online platform like Zoom is being able to bring in experts from across the country. So I thank you so much for taking the time out of your day and joining us here and helping out the potato producers here in North Carolina. You know, with this, I will introduce myself for those that don't know me. I am Austin Brown, the Camden County Agriculture Agent, and I'll be remiss if I didn't recognize the other two people that are involved with organizing this meeting every year, and that's Grace Manzer. She's a Commercial Horticulture Agent in Pasquotank that you heard from earlier. And then Erin Ewer's been doing a lot of the stuff behind the scenes, making all this happen, but she's our area specialized agent for our corner of the state, well, for a lot of the state with commercial hort crops. So with that, I'll go ahead and introduce. We're going to move into a question and answer portion here. But before we do that, I would just remind everybody, if you do want NCDA credits, if you haven't, go ahead and put your name, county, and pesticide number in the chat. So we'll capture that. And if for some reason you don't have camera capabilities, if you'll just retype your name in there again so we can certify that you were here and actively participating in the program. Appreciate everybody being here. You know, if you've come to our potato meetings in the past, the other two, we've got two people from NC State who've been to those meetings in the past, and we're thankful they're here again. That's Dr. Jean Restaino. She is a William Neal Reynolds Distinguished Professor and is the Director of Emerging Plant Diseases and Global Food Security Cluster. And then we also have Dr. Anders Huseth, who is Assistant Professor and Extension Entomology Specialist. So with that, I think I've covered all the housekeeping. So feel free to unmute yourself, fire away with any questions you may have for Dr. Gevins or any of the other two panelists as well. Or you can always type them in the chat and I'll make sure we get to them.
Well, I can prime the pump a little bit here. I have a question. So I think I remember scouting potatoes in central Wisconsin in 2002, my first job out of high school. And, you know, we were using a lot of Bravo weather stick at that time. And so we're still using Bravo weather stick 4 or 5 times during the season. And then now with pre-packs with these multi-site fungicides, how long do we expect that to last? Is there going to be resistance? Are there going to be trade barriers that happen as far as using Bravo? What's the future of that material?
Yeah, it's a good question, Anders. And yeah, it's one that, you know, as we see other countries, we see Europe and Canada have, you know, they've changed their restrictions on mancozeb, and we know that there's revision to chlorothalonil as well coming up again in the U.S. through EPA, and with, you know, the imposition now looking at the Endangered Species Act in light of some of these registrations. We know there'll be a time when probably we won't have access to chlorothalonil. And here in Wisconsin, we've reduced, the approach that I take anyway, is that we've reduced the amount that we use per acre, because we are, in many cases, we're mixing with other single site modes of action. We're using them in a more targeted timing due to the use of our disease modeling tools. But while we have them, the one thing they do is enable us to enhance the lifespan of the reduced risk fungicides. So if we take them out now in anticipation of a change in registration, we're really just hastening the burnout of the active ingredients that we have, right? So the way I have thought about it is I'm sensitive to the environmental impact, but I think growers, while they still have access to, and there's cost efficiency, especially leading into this year. Wisconsin, it used to cost about $3,800 an acre to grow potatoes. Now it's probably closer to $5,000, and fertility costs are going up all the time. I think we have to be wise with the tool selection. And so in advising, I think we're careful. We have, and we continue to explore tools and programs which take out chlorothalonil, take out mancozeb. But while we still have access to them, I think they're wise to use in management of disease in an economical way and a prevention of resistance development to the other modes of action that we have. But the premixes also help this too, right? So when you have a premix with two different or more different modes of action with similar targets, you're also in effect doing the same thing, right? You're helping to reduce the development of resistance. And so one thing that we've been exploring is sort of getting rid of the chlorothalonil, getting rid of the mancozeb, but just looking at something like a fluopyram plus a difenoconazole, right? So that way you've got two reduced risk fungicides with the same targets, but when you put them together, you're also helping to reduce the risk of fungicide development to either of those individually. So very good point. We're mindful of it, but my approach forward has been to continue to recommend these broad spectrums judiciously while they're still accessible to the industry.
Amanda, I would just add in on some of the fungicide sensitivity. Knowing the genotype of P. infestans is important in terms of fungicide resistance. The US 23 in general has been sensitive to metalaxyl. And although there are now some studies showing there may be some variation in sensitivity to that compound, but about 5-6 years ago, we screened all the US genotypes, and they were mostly sensitive to the available OMIC targeted fungicides. But in Europe, there's now resistance being reported to fluazinim in certain lineages of Phytophthora infestans. So that's why we continue to genotype the pathogen, and through the USA Blight Network, some of that's going on in my lab, and Amanda mentioned she genotypes, and also Chris Smart at Cornell has been doing genotyping.
Amanda, I think there's a question in the chat.
Sorry.
So how common is it to use different fungicides for Solani versus Alternaria?
Yeah, it's a good question. Generally, we don't. We use the same ones. Same active ingredients should do well across both species. But what we're starting to see in terms of differentiation is that the alternata, the way the mutations within alternata work are a little bit different than Solani. So early blight just is, in some, it's become a bit more resistant to azoxystrobin and other QOIs a lot more rapidly than the early blight pathogen. So I always ask growers to get a better idea of what spot, what alternaria is most aggressive, because if it seems to be the brown spot, then then really I recommend you pull away any QOIs or any of the strobilurins out of the program, because it's likely that's already completely resistant. You might still have some sensitivity left in the early blight population, but there's just a distinction there. And as we begin to better understand the way resistance works mechanistically within each of those pathogens to other fungicides, it's just good to know which one you have, because they're not always acting, they don't always behave the same way in resistance.
Thank you.
I have a question, and this might pull in Amanda and Jean. A two-part question. Amanda, correct me if I'm wrong. I think earlier when you were talking about in-furrow fungicides, and I believe we have some growers that do that. I'm not sure if they all do. But you mentioned that Quadris and then the biologicals were labeled for late blight in-furrow, but you would not, and maybe Quadris had shown some efficacy, but you really wouldn't recommend either one of them. So clarify that for me if I heard that correctly. And the second part of that is, and where Gene may be able to speak to, where we've had growers, where we've had Phytophthora nicotiana showing up here, which is, can survive in the soil. Would that be something where Quadris as an in-furrow, like if they have to cut their rotation short or something to come back into one of those affected fields, would Quadris be advised or helpful there?
It's a good point, Erin. Yeah, so azoxystrobin, it's a decent fungicide against Phytophthora species generally, but it's not the best one, right? So those in-furrow treatments, and again, it depends where the timing. So with late blight here in our state, with infestans where it's likely introduced, it's probably on seed somewhere or inadvertently in some residual source, but it's either introduced because spores are landing a bit later in the season, or spores form after there's been there's seed infection and there's sporulation and it's early season there. So in using an in-furrow to target late blight in our state is you'd have to know that you likely have a seed infection for that to really work well. Otherwise, it's not going to target, because the pathogen may be coming in aerially in sort of spore shower event later on in the season than at time of planting. But with Nicotiana, that's a really good point. And certainly I know Gene has done much more extensive work in this pathogen. We see Nicotiana very infrequently. We often see it before any of the late blight finds happen in Wisconsin, and we often see it in a irrigation track, where there's compaction and there's more moisture. And it looks different. We have, our crop scouts have seen it, and they're good at discerning it visually. It often is not sporulating, but could an in-furrow help there? It may. I don't know what the resistance status of Nicotiana is. I mean, a lot of that is it's there because of tobacco history, right, Gene?
Well, we've been collecting for about 4 or 5 years, some from these sites in eastern North Carolina, and we've been screening all the isolates for mefenoxam sensitivity. It's sensitive to mefenoxam, so that might be your best bet in terms of disease control, rather than using we haven't screened the other compounds, only mefenoxam, and consistently every isolate that we've collected is sensitive to mefenoxam. So just using Ritamil may be the way to go. And it's labeled, I believe, for Nicotiana on potatoes.
Thank you.
Gene, is it known if the Nicotiana that's affecting potatoes now, and it seems like there's been some kind of uptick in some way, or maybe it's just being explored more deeply now than it was, but do you suppose that it's been newly introduced within potato, or is it there? I've always wondered about the history of tobacco production in some of these locations that might be growing potatoes now. Is it because of black shank history, or are these separate?
The fields where we're finding it are not fields that have had a history of tobacco. I think it's probably moving in the potato seed itself. And then in areas where it's showed up, it's been areas where we've had a lot of flooding, after climate, more rainfall. We've got fields with standing water. And what we're doing now is we're running microsat analysis. We're trying to genotype, and we're going to compare to the tobacco isolates. I doubt it's coming from tobacco fields. I think it's coming in on potatoes. And Neil Goodwinston reported about 5-6 years ago, I think he and Dave Shue did a study looking at tobacco and Nicotiana, and had a few potato ones, but they didn't genotype anything. We'll be able to tell whether it's the same or different than the tobacco isolates by doing this. And we have an undergrad that's being funded off a research project that's working on some of that right now.
Thank you.
If anybody has any more questions, feel free to ask them. I just wanted to point out that I put a evaluation in our chat. If anybody would like to evaluate our session, that would be great. But feel free to stay on if there's any other questions. And if not, thank you guys so much. Thank you, Dr. Gevins and Dr. Restano and Dr. Huseth for being here and sharing your information with us and sharing your time. We really, really appreciate it. Erin, Austin, you guys have anything to add?
I just want to make sure that nobody had a question. Now's a good opportunity to ask them if you got them. So I think we'll hold it open for just a minute in case anybody thinks of one.
If anyone would like any of the slides, if it's useful to you, feel free to, if the organizers want to email me, I can send a PowerPoint, or feel free to email me direct. I'm happy to share.
Are you still curious if you're doing any more hyperspectral imaging? I know you were,
Yeah.
Katie Gold, she's at Cornell now. That's great. And the work was really.
Yeah, we do. We have a new student and postdoc working on that. And what Jean is mentioning is we've been using airplane mounted spectral reflectance data to determine the presence of late blight in potatoes prior to symptom development. And so I had a student that she wrapped up her PhD. She's now at Cornell University applying these concepts in wine grapes. But what we did develop was a really nice tool that tells us that late blight is present about 4 days before symptoms would develop. So it was really an interesting innovation. What we've done is we've moved it. The algorithm that drove that is a complicated one, right? It's looking at so many unique spectra in kind of thinking about this as a fingerprint, but with unique spectra that give us that information. We've backed up. We kind of cut out the granularity and made it so it's a bit more feasible with the spectra that we're choosing. So it's more multispectral now rather than hyperspectral. And this allows us to use more cost-effective sensors in deploying this technology in a practical way. And so now we're advancing that approach. We can still make the detections prior to symptom development in potato, but the goal now is to operationally script this so that more instantaneously we can collect those data. Because if growers, if they hear that we can detect late blight 4 days before symptoms, that's great. But if you don't know until 2 weeks later, it's really useless information. So, so we're trying to hasten the data process, right? So that information can be, as soon as that plane lands, or as soon as the data is downloaded, that can be processed, and that is information in hand to do something, to apply a curative fungicide. So you never allow the disease to progress to sporulation, and it won't, it hypothetically wouldn't spread further. So there's great potential here. And we have a student, and we, meaning myself and Dr. Phil Townsend, who's a remote sensing expert in forest and wildlife ecology here at UW-Madison. We're looking out about 2 years to have a practical tool.
We're using sensor technology, volatile and lamp-based sensor technology, trying to feed sensor detection prior to symptoms using handheld sensors and smartphones to link into predicting when to spray a fungicide. Kind of different tools, but similar ideas coming from different angles.
Yeah, it would be great to have these additional tools in the practice.
Well, we certainly want to be respectful of everybody's time. I know we ran over a touch here, but I will just add to what Grace said, if you would please take time to fill out the evaluation. That certainly helps us in planning for future programs and make sure that we're doing the best job we can to serve you. So please do that. And, as we get ready, it won't be long. February will be here, and early March we'll be planting potatoes. So, as we go into the season, if there's any diseases, I know that's been a hot topic we talked about today and certainly timely. Call your local extension agent and for any sampling needs, if you got anything. So feel free to use us. So